Have you ever looked at one of those so-called ancient towers rising from the forgotten world and felt something was wrong? Not with the stone, but with the story? Not defensive enough to be a watchtower, not ceremonial enough to be a temple, not accessible enough to be a minaret. You stare at it. It stares back. Its shape is familiar and yet deeply alien. You feel its proportions. You sense its silence. And somewhere deep inside, a question forms that most never ask. What if this wasn't a tower at all? What if we were never meant to stand atop it, but to stand beside it and listen? And now, before we dive deeper, take a moment. If this mystery has already pulled you in, if you're starting to question what you thought you knew about these structures, do 3 things for us. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another historical mystery we uncover. Then, comment below with where you're watching from and the current time. We want to know how far this mystery has reached. Finally, share this video with someone who loves the secrets of the past. Let them know you've discovered something unusual, and if what we're saying so far already makes the title make sense to you, then you're ready. Because the truth about these towers changes everything. They appear all across the former territories of what some call the Lost Empire of Tartaria, from the windswept steppes of Central Asia to the mountain-bent cities of the Caucasus. You can find them in old sketches, in fading photographs, in buried ruins beneath city foundations. Despite the distance, despite the centuries, they share 3 impossible traits. First, their interiors lack staircases or any practical path upward. Second, their surfaces are not merely decorated, but mathematically patterned. And third, when sound enters, any sound, it doesn't echo. It sings. A whisper becomes a vibration. A clap becomes a hum. Your voice doesn't bounce. It climbs. These are not legends. These are measurable acoustic phenomena. The spiral grooves inside these towers don't correspond to decoration. They obey physical law. Their angles are consistent. Their purpose, concealed. Some towers contain vertical rods, now rusted, running along the shaft. Others are completely hollow, leading to a single opening at the top, precise, narrow, and not aligned to any religious axis or sun cycle. It's not a window, it's a mechanism. And then you notice the spacing, across maps, across continents. These towers form lines, grids, hexagons, not random placement, but deliberate geometry. In one city, 3 towers form a perfect equilateral triangle. In another, a square aligned to cardinal directions. In a third, a honeycomb array spreading over hundreds of kilometers. Who builds this way? Without coordination? Without written record? Locals, across regions, say the towers breathed, that the wind was gentler near them, that children slept easier when the towers sang, that sick relatives recovered faster if brought to the tower's base during fever season. These aren't mystical stories. They're lived experiences, accounts from people who didn't study resonance or airflow, but knew the towers worked. And yet, in official history, they are labeled decorative, minarets, watchtowers, bell towers, but always something incomplete, something that fails to explain why they were built with ratios drawn from harmonic frequencies, why they appear across 8 countries with identical proportions, why they're spaced apart by precisely 144 kilometers in some regions, or why almost all were demolished between the late 1800s and early 1900s, without blueprints, without study, without hesitation. So, we ask again, what if they were never towers? What if they were never meant for people to climb? What if they were not architectural statements, but environmental instruments? What if they were machines? The towers are gone now, most of them, but their shadows remain, in the proportions of train stations, in the hum of certain stairwells, in the silence of places that used to sing. What we've forgotten is not a myth. It is a function, one that once shaped the air itself. It begins with a photograph, grainy, brown-tinted, dated 1889, a lonely column of stone rising into the empty sky of Turkestan, taken by a Russian military surveyor. No surrounding buildings, no connecting roads, no visible entrance, just a tower on flat terrain that seems to serve no earthly purpose. The official record labels it decorative minaret. But the image tells a different story. Through a breach in the wall, the tower's interior is visible, hollow, filled with metal rods, and carved with a spiraling pattern along its inner shaft. No stairs, no platforms, no place for a bell, a watchman, or a priest. And at the top, not a window, but a circular aperture, cut with unsettling precision. The photograph is now archived in the Central Asian Studies collection in St. Petersburg. The shadow cast by the tower doesn't align with the sun's angle. It bends slightly, unnaturally, as if the tower warps the light around it. In the margins of the surveyor's notes, a phrase appears, penned in a different ink and by a different hand. Verify acoustic properties. No follow-up exists, no test results. Only the lingering remark that local inhabitants claimed the structure hummed during storms. Not rang, not echoed, hummed. That tower, documented in such detail, was demolished 2 years later. The reason given? Unstable foundation. But 17 other photographs from the same era show similar towers scattered across Central Asia. Kay, Bukhara, Samarkand, different surveyors, different dates, same architecture, all towers listed as decorative, all demolished within 5 years of documentation. And in every case, the interior cavities followed the same logic. Hollow shafts, spiral grooves, vertical rods, and no practical utility. Then came the watercolor, found in a private French collection in Lyon in the early 2000s. It depicts the same tower from Turkestan, but dated May of 1846, 43 years earlier than the Russian photograph. What's remarkable is not just the date, but the label. In careful Russian script, the artist identifies the structure as a vertical resonant column, not minaret, not monument, not decorative tower, column, resonant. This term never appears in the later Russian records. In fact, it disappears entirely from official usage. Someone once knew exactly what the structure was, and then that knowledge was simply gone. What makes the watercolor truly remarkable are the notations. Measurements are scattered throughout the cross-sectional diagram, but they are not standard architectural units. Instead, they appear to represent frequency ratios, mathematical relationships between oscillations, not lengths. These are numbers from acoustics, not masonry. The metal rods inside the tower are drawn clearly, and their positioning suggests they were not for support, but for tuning. This was not an aesthetic choice. It was design. And that brings us to the blueprint. In 2003, an archivist in Paris opened a long-forgotten folder from the estate of a minor French engineer who died in 1847. Inside was a folded technical drawing labeled in fine script, Vertical Resonant Shaft, 1848. The drawing is flawless. It shows a tower nearly identical to the one in Turkestan, laid bare in cross-section, every cavity labeled, every groove measured, every rod placed with mathematical care. And yet, again, the notations are not lengths. They are frequencies, numbers like 7.83 Hertz, later known as the Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic pulse. This frequency was officially discovered only in 1952, more than a century after the blueprint was drawn. So, how did a French engineer in 1848 know to tune a structure to it? And how did he know the exact internal geometry of a tower built decades earlier and thousands of kilometers away? No record exists of French expeditions reaching Turkestan in that period. No known scientific exchanges. No architectural imports. And yet, the proportions match with eerie precision. The engineer who drew the blueprint was named Claude Moreau, a specialist in railway bridge design. His estate records mention nothing about acoustics or Central Asia, and the blueprint itself is dated a year after his death. Was it filed posthumously? Was it completed by someone else? The paper is authentic, cotton weave, iron gall ink, mid-19th century. The fold lines suggest it was used, not stored, a working document, but who was using it, and for what? In the margins of the blueprint, faint notes in a cramped, different handwriting appear. Tested in reduced model produces sustained tone at 7.83. Another line reads, amplitude increases with height, optimal at 40 meters. A third note is partially scratched out. Not for bells, not for observation, purpose is. The sentence ends abruptly, then is struck through in thick ink. Whoever wrote these notes knew what they were observing, then chose not to finish the thought, or chose to conceal it. One line, however, was left uncensored, scribbled along the bottom edge. If others exist, they must share these proportions. Others, not one tower, a system, a network. And here, the rational explanation begins to fail entirely. If towers across multiple countries, separated by mountains and languages, shared the same internal proportions, then something coordinated them. Someone coordinated them. Modern scholars might dismiss the blueprint as speculative. Perhaps it was a fantasy, a thought experiment, or an obscure architectural theory. But that explanation crumbles when placed next to the physical towers, the photographs, the watercolors, the reports from military surveyors. Each one a piece of evidence pointing toward deliberate design, design with intention, design with function. That's where the mystery intensifies, because these structures, so clearly engineered, were systematically misfiled, mislabeled, and destroyed, not hidden, not concealed, just dismissed. The photograph labeled minaret, the blueprint shelved under railway infrastructure, the spiral grooves called ornamental, the humming called local superstition, and in every case, the one word that should have raised flags, resonance, was removed. This is how knowledge disappears, not through flames or violence, but through paperwork. Through the quiet erosion of understanding, an engineer dies, and his drawings go unclaimed. A tower is photographed, then bulldozed. A local's testimony is written down, then ignored. A blueprint is misfiled. A watercolor is sold at auction with no provenance. And one by one, the pieces fall out of the narrative. But if the towers were just decoration, why the blueprints? Why the precise frequency markings? Why the detailed observations of vertical airflow and sound amplification? And why the silence that followed? The answer, perhaps, lies not in what we know, but in what we forgot, or were told to forget, because the evidence is there, etched in stone, penciled on paper, whispered in margins, a pattern too widespread to ignore, too consistent to dismiss, and too functional to be coincidental. Something happened in the 19th century, a moment of clarity, of understanding, that was quickly swallowed by the rising tide of modernity. Engineers noticed the anomalies, researchers drafted the measurements, locals remembered the effects, but the institutions labeled them irrelevant, and the towers fell. But the documents survived, and now, as we re-examine what they show us, we face a decision. Do we accept the labels history handed down, or do we begin to ask what those labels were designed to hide? In the spring of 2017, a Polish acoustician named Marek Wojcik stepped into a forgotten tower in Turkestan. His mission was not to hunt ancient mysteries, but to study environmental decay. Funded by a conservation initiative, his job was simple: catalog acoustic profiles for structures at risk of collapse. He expected mild reverberations, the sort of echoes you'd find in a cathedral or mosque. What he recorded instead has yet to be fully explained by any known architectural model. Wojcik set up his instruments, a microphone array calibrated for low-frequency measurements, an ambient noise monitor, and a wind input recorder. Then, standing near the center of the hollow shaft, he said a single sentence. His voice entered the space and began to climb. Not bounce, climb. The sound didn't reflect, it rotated. A spiral of vibration slowly rose, stretching upward with a tonal shift that dropped in frequency as it ascended. His 2-second sentence echoed as a 14-second hum, not louder, not clearer, but different. Almost musical, not melody, but tone, not echo, but transformation. He repeated the experiment again and again, the same result. Then he stepped aside and let the wind speak instead. A breeze entered from the low doorway and rose through the shaft. The instruments captured the same phenomena. The sound twisted upward in a continuous resonance, not chaotic, but focused, like the tower was singing back. And the frequency? precisely 7.8 hertz. He didn't know what that meant at the time. He just logged the data and moved on. But back in Warsaw, while reviewing the recordings at the Institute of Acoustics, Wojciech's team made a connection. That frequency wasn't random. It matched what modern science calls the Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic heartbeat, identified by physicist Winfried Otto Schumann in 1952. This frequency is not emitted by the planet's core or crust, but by the space between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. It is the background hum of the world, and the tower matched it perfectly. This discovery alone might be dismissed as coincidence, until the pattern repeated. Over the next 2 years, Wojciech and his team visited 9 other towers across Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. 7 were structurally intact enough to measure. All 7 produced the same rising, spiraling resonance. All hovered between 7 and 8 hertz. All shared identical interior dimensions. A height-to-width ratio of 1 to 6.18, the golden ratio. All contain vertical shafts with spiral grooves angled precisely at 23 degrees. These were not echoes of chaos. They were tuned responses, and they were consistent. Most astonishing of all, the spiral grooves inside each tower were not symmetrical. They twisted with a directional bias, 6 towers spiraling counterclockwise, 1 spiraling clockwise. Why the difference? The clockwise tower stood alone, geographically distant from the others, located 30 degrees of longitude east. When Wojciech mapped the tower's locations, the anomaly grew sharper. The distances between towers weren't random, in several regions. They measured precisely 144 kilometers apart. That number, 12 times 12, has appeared in ancient metrology from Babylonian texts to medieval European cathedrals. It recurs not by accident, but by purpose. At first, the findings seemed like a revelation. A forgotten civilization, possibly Tartaria, had built towers capable of matching Earth's own frequency. But what purpose could that serve? What use would such a frequency have? It turns out, quite a lot. In modern neuroscience, the human brain produces alpha waves between 7 and 8 hertz during states of calm, meditation, and healing. Exposure to vibrations within this range has been shown to reduce stress hormones, lower heart rate, and ease respiratory effort. In acoustic therapy, tones tuned to 7.83 hertz are used to treat anxiety and sleep disorders. Our bodies recognize this frequency not just as sound, but as safety, as peace. Wojciech didn't know this when he entered the tower, but the people who lived beside it always did. In the archives of Turkestan, oral histories recorded during the 1930s speak of people gathering at the base of towers during storms. Elders said the towers soothed the wind. Children fell asleep beside them when wind shrieked over the steps. Animals stopped panicking. The air felt softer, said one woman. Another testimony, dated 1941, reads, "The towers sang at night, not music, but a hum that wrapped around your chest and made you peaceful." These are not metaphors. These are sensory memories, people describing what their bodies felt, not what their minds imagined. Another account from Bukhara tells of families sleeping in the shadow of a tower during fever season. "My grandfather said the stones breathed cold," one man recalled. "They pulled the sickness out of the air." These stories appear again and again, not technical explanations, but lived knowledge, a kind of empirical wisdom, passed down through observation. People didn't know about resonance, but they knew the towers worked. And so the question sharpens. If the towers resonate at the same frequency as Earth, and that frequency calms the human body, then who built them to do this, and why? The mystery deepens when one compares the measured frequencies to the 1848 French blueprint we encountered earlier. That document lists 7.83 hertz as the target value, not a modern revision, not a misinterpretation. A number written down more than 100 years before the Schumann resonance was officially discovered. How? The blueprint even notes that amplitude increases with tower height, and that the optimal resonance appears near 40 meters, exactly the height of the towers Wojciech measured. This is not anecdotal. It is scientific, repeatable, verifiable. it is also deeply unsettling, because if these towers were built to resonate with Earth's frequency, and that frequency directly affects human physiology, then the towers were not monuments. They were instruments, not of worship, but of environmental harmony. And if a civilization once understood how to build these instruments using nothing but stone, proportion, and geometry, what else did they know? Wojciech's final report, published quietly in 2019, contains a single sentence that captures the enormity of the problem. The interior geometry creates a vertical resonant chamber inconsistent with known architectural acoustics. In other words, the towers behave like no structure we've designed before. They don't reflect sound, they shape it, they transform it, they breathe it. That report was never picked up by major journals. It was labeled unverified, yet the data is there. And more importantly, the experience is repeatable. Anyone can visit these towers, what few remain, and hear the hum, feel the shift, sense the silence bend. Wojciech didn't seek out a mystery. He walked into one, and like the engineers before him, he recorded his findings, submitted his results, and watched as institutions looked away. Perhaps not out of conspiracy, but because the implications are too vast, too strange, too inconvenient. Because if the towers truly did channel Earth's pulse, if they harmonized with our biology and the sky above, then they were doing something we've barely begun to understand. They weren't just architecture, they were medicine, they were atmosphere, they were instruments of alignment between the planet and the people who lived on it. And if we've forgotten how they worked, it wasn't because they failed us. It was because we failed to listen. When graduate student Elena Kovac began her thesis in 2021, she didn't expect to uncover one of the most startling cartographic revelations of the century. A student of architectural history at the University of Belgrade, she had set out to map what remained of the so-called Tartarian towers. Her goal was modest: collect measurements, compare regional design traits, and perhaps contribute to the debate around their supposed origins. She expected local variation, differences shaped by culture, climate, material. What she found instead was uniformity so exact, it defied reason. Her initial data set included 43 towers across 8 countries, stretching from Siberia in the north to Persia in the south, and from the Balkans to the edge of Mongolia. Yet, regardless of distance, regardless of terrain or empire, the towers shared the same mathematical DNA. Height to width ratio, 1 to 6.18. Interior shaft diameter, 1/17 of total height. Spiral groove angle, 23 degrees. Aperture placement, exactly 63% of the way up. Not similar, identical. And the further she looked, the more impossible it became to dismiss these numbers as coincidence. Most architectural styles change depending on materials, local traditions, or available tools. Arches in Italy do not resemble those in Persia. Foundations in Russia differ from those in North Africa. But these towers, separated by deserts, seas, and centuries, stood like twins. The golden ratio was not merely present, it governed every major dimension. These weren't local experiments, they were replications of a master design. Kovac was cautious in her analysis. Her thesis did not speculate about lost empires or forbidden technologies. It simply laid out the numbers. But in a quiet paragraph near the end, she wrote a line that would haunt anyone who's ever studied ancient engineering. The absence of regional variation in core geometry implies either a standardized design template shared across long distances, or multiple independent discoveries of identical ratios, an event with near zero statistical probability. Translation: this should not happen, not naturally, not accidentally. To visualize the spread, Kovac plotted the towers on a digital map. That's when the second shock emerged. The towers weren't scattered, they were aligned. Straight lines began to appear, connecting towers hundreds of kilometers apart. Some clusters formed geometric shapes. In Samarkand, 3 towers formed an equilateral triangle with sides measuring exactly 3,600 meters. In Bukhara, 4 towers made a perfect square, aligned to the cardinal directions. In Kazan, 6 towers encircled the city in a hexagon, each side identical in length. This wasn't urban sprawl. It was geometry on a continental scale. She overlaid these alignments onto old imperial maps and found further confirmation. In cities where towers had been demolished, their locations still appeared in regional planning documents. Their footprints, marked with notations like ancient structure or obsolete column, revealed placements that completed triangles or squares. Even when half the nodes were missing, the invisible lines connecting them still held. And they were not just close. They were perfect, measurable down to the meter. In Central Asia, the spacing between towers showed another pattern. Distances ranged between 120 and 150 kilometers, with certain sectors holding an exact figure of 144. That number, 12 times 12, had deep roots in ancient systems of measurement. It appears in Babylonian astronomy, in Hebrew texts, in the design of medieval European cathedrals. Why would such a number dictate the spacing of towers across thousands of kilometers? This was no architectural flourish. It was infrastructure, and it behaved more like circuitry than construction. As Kovacs extended her study, the shapes began to repeat: hexagons, squares, equilateral triangles, forms that offered not just visual harmony, but structural stability and signal coordination. When mapped onto modern satellite imagery, the grids were clearer than ever. The tower locations formed honeycomb networks stretching across vast territories, networks that matched no known road system, no trade route, no imperial boundary. They obeyed only one law: mathematical precision. Yet when she submitted her findings for publication, journals refused. Too speculative, too disruptive, too uncomfortable. Geometry, it seems, had become a threat. And so, the data, measurable, visible, undeniable, was quietly shelved once more. But if we take her maps seriously, a new possibility emerges. These towers weren't just independent monuments. They were nodes in a vast, interconnected system, not built for show, but for function. A network where each piece strengthened the next, where space itself was tuned through shape, through placement, through resonance. Kovacs's maps show a civilization that understood scale, that engineered not just for beauty or worship, but for harmonics and geography. A civilization that could measure over mountains, that could synchronize construction across empires. And perhaps, most chilling of all, a civilization that left no written record of doing so. But maybe records weren't necessary. Maybe the towers were the record, engraved not in ink, but in stone and silence. The implication is staggering. It means that across at least 8 countries, dozens of cultures, and thousands of kilometers, builders followed the same proportions with no formal blueprint. They built as if answering a shared memory, or following a code. If this were a single occurrence, it could be dismissed, but it repeats, over and over, in maps, in ruins, in oral traditions, in the golden numbers that appear like fingerprints on every stone. And that's what makes it more than coincidence. It's a pattern, and patterns beg for explanation. Did a central authority dictate the measurements? Did builders pass the knowledge across generations through rituals or apprenticeship? Or was there a shared understanding, a common logic rooted in environmental experience? We don't yet know, but we do know this. Whatever system once tied these towers together, it was deliberate, not random, not decorative, not religious. It was planned, engineered, executed, then, somehow, forgotten. But the geometry remained, and geometry, unlike memory, does not lie. By the early 21st century, the pieces began to converge: photographs, blueprints, acoustic tests, and geometric grids. But what none of them alone could explain became clear when seen together. The Tartarian towers were not monuments. They were functional, not spiritual altars or war beacons, but environmental machines, tuned not for the gods or for kings, but for the air itself, and for the people who breathed it. In 2019, a team of structural engineers in Uzbekistan conducted a series of laser scans on 3 partially preserved towers near the city of Khiva. Unlike earlier manual surveys, these scans revealed secrets hidden behind the stone. The towers, though seemingly uniform from outside, contained subtle interior variations. The vertical shafts narrowed and widened at regular intervals, Recessed cavities were hidden within the walls, chambers invisible to the naked eye, but placed at precise heights, every 7 meters in 2 towers, every 9 meters in the third. These weren't random, they were resonance chambers, what modern concert halls now use to shape sound behavior. But these towers were centuries old, built with no access to digital modeling, no electricity, no advanced instrumentation. The engineers cross-referenced the results with older survey data. The pattern was unmistakable, each chamber aligned with known acoustic pressure nodes. In layman's terms, the towers weren't just allowing sound to echo, they were guiding it, amplifying certain frequencies and dampening others. They were turning wind and voice into a designed vibration field. This is the domain of modern physics, but these towers had it carved into stone, with no written manuals, with no attached wires, just shape, angle, proportion, and the effects were not theoretical. In the British Library, a travel journal from 1837, written by the surveyor Thomas Blackwell, offers a vivid account. He describes sleeping inside a tower near Merv for 3 nights. "The air," he wrote, "feels cool, even at midday. The walls breathe. In the morning and evening, the stone vibrates faintly, like the thrum of a distant organ. It calms the nerves." His notes were never published, stored in a forgotten folder of colonial papers, rediscovered only in 2006. Yet they match perfectly what modern sensors later confirmed. So, what were these towers doing? First, they circulated air. Warm air entering the base rose through the hollow shaft, pulled upward by the spiral grooves carved into the interior wall. As the air rotated, it created a natural convection current. This wasn't guesswork. It's now known that spiraling air rises faster and more cleanly than turbulent flow. The towers harnessed that principle passively. The shape did the work. No moving parts. No energy required. They breathed. Second, they regulated temperature. Stone, especially thick masonry, has thermal mass. It absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night. But because the towers were hollow, they lacked the full heat-retaining burden. Instead, their form functioned like a chimney. The sun heated the exterior, the inner air rose, and cooler air was drawn in from ground level. Result? The surrounding area stayed measurably cooler during the hottest months. Third, the towers modulated pressure. The vertical column created a localized low-pressure zone at the top. Even without wind, air would be drawn upward, pulling surrounding air with it. This passive draw created circulation in city streets and squares, disrupting stagnation and dispersing dust and heat. In wind-heavy regions, the effect intensified, diffusing harsh gusts into smoother, rotational flows. Fourth, humidity control. As the air rotated upward, moisture in the air condensed along the cooler stone surfaces, forming droplets that trickled down the grooves. This was not dramatic rainfall, but in dry regions, it added micro-humidity into the system. In wet seasons, it helped remove excess moisture from the air column. The towers, in essence, created localized atmospheric balance, a tiny but persistent correction of extremes. Fifth, and perhaps most mysterious, was the effect on human health. Repeatedly, historical observers recorded people gathering near the towers during fevers, storms, or breathing troubles. In 1843, Russian engineer Pavel Solov wrote in his journal, "Families bring sick children to the towers. After 3 to 5 days, many show improvement. I cannot dismiss this." He reported a faint vibration inside the tower, consistent even in still air. The vibration wasn't strong enough to hear, but could be felt in the body. This brings us back to resonance. At 7.83 hertz, the towers produced vibrations matching the Schumann resonance, the same frequency used in modern acoustic therapy. Exposure to this frequency is known to calm the nervous system, balance heart rate, and enhance respiratory function. The towers, by virtue of their geometry and airflow, replicated this frequency naturally, not with speakers, not with machines, but with proportion. It's not hard to imagine why people returned to the towers during illness. Their bodies responded instinctively, just as animals returned to mineral springs or shade groves without understanding chemistry. The residents of these ancient cities felt the towers' effects and followed them. But here's the most astonishing part. The towers didn't work in isolation. Across the landscape, their spacing matched exact distances: 120 kilometers, 144 kilometers, sometimes more. The geometry between towers formed hexagons, triangles, even city-scale mandalas. In Samarkand, 3 towers once formed a triangle that enveloped the city center, providing continuous air movement. In Bukhara, 4 towers outlined the old quarter in a square, aligned perfectly with the compass. In Kazan, 6 towers formed a hexagon around the civic district. These were not decorative placements, they were systems, and each node amplified the others. Some researchers now believe that when all towers functioned together, they created overlapping zones of atmospheric stability, air that moved more gently, temperatures that fluctuated less, sounds that were diffused and calmed, a soft, living infrastructure that worked with nature, not against it. In the Caucasus, there's a proverb recorded in 1924. The city breathes when the tower sings. No one remembers who said it first, but perhaps it was never meant metaphorically. The towers were more than buildings. They were instruments. Their song was not meant for ears. It was meant for lungs, for nerves, for the air itself. And their silence, once broken, may still echo across the cities they once protected. From the 1880s to the early 20th century, a silent purge unfolded across Central Asia, the Caucasus, Persia, and the outer territories of the former Ottoman Empire. It was not a purge of people, nor even of language, but of structure, of stone, of memory. One by one, the towers fell, and no one, not the bureaucrats who ordered their demolition, nor the engineers who carried it out, seemed to understand what they were destroying. Or worse, they did, and chose to proceed anyway. The justifications were tidy. In archive after archive, demolition records from regional authorities repeat the same phrases. Unnecessary structure, obstructs development, no longer serves a modern function. Architectural excess from earlier era, the same cold logic used to erase aqueducts, fountains, arcades. Yet with the towers, something deeper was being erased. Not just stone, but coherence, systems, infrastructure. In Samarkand, 3 towers that formed a perfect triangle around the ancient city center were demolished in 1891. The reason? They obstructed plans for a new boulevard. In Bukhara, 4 towers forming a precise square, each aligned to a cardinal direction, were removed in 1896. The stone was repurposed for the foundation of a new railway station. No one documented the internal layout of the towers before they fell. No one preserved their measurements. No one thought to ask why the same geometry is repeated in every major city. This is what modernization often does. It replaces without understanding. It bulldozes before it studies. It favors speed over memory, efficiency over mystery, and the towers, in the eyes of the imperial bureaucracies and revolutionary city planners, were relics, superstitions, useless, outdated things. In Tashkent, 6 towers vanished between 1902 and 1908. The city's modernization report called for their removal under the banner of urban clarity and visual hygiene. The language is stark, almost surgical. The towers were obstacles, not assets. Their function unrecognized, their proportions dismissed, their acoustic qualities never measured. Not a single formal study was conducted before they were pulled down. Even when structural anomalies were noted, they were used not to inspire curiosity, but as excuses for demolition. A rare hand-drawn sketch survives in the Tbilisi Municipal Archive, dated 1903. It depicts one of the last towers scheduled for removal. The drawing is rough, and it shows only the exterior, but at the bottom, a chilling note is scrawled, "Interior unsafe, unstable pressure chambers, demolish immediately." No explanation, no analysis, just removal. By 1920, most towers within the Russian territories were gone. In Persia, the demolitions continued into the 30s. In Ottoman regions, the fall accelerated after World War I. The Balkans saw rapid tower destruction during the interwar years. Soviet industrial expansion wiped out nearly all remaining examples in Baltic cities by the mid-century. A Soviet municipal report from Kazan, dated 1937, lists 6 towers as having been demolished in a 13-year span. The stated reason: structures represent superstitious, pre-revolutionary thinking, removal necessary for socialist urban development. Superstitious, obsolete, excess. None of these labels describe what the towers truly were: passive environmental systems, acoustic resonators, climatic stabilizers, air filters. Instead, they were reclassified as monuments to ignorance, and thus made acceptable targets for removal. Where are the demolition plans, the blueprints, the architectural drawings? Standard 19th century demolition procedure, even in the most remote parts of empire, required documentation of structural materials, load distribution, and measurements, especially when the stone was to be reused. Yet, in all of the known cases, barely a handful of technical drawings survive. The towers were torn apart before they were even examined. A demolition record from Samarkand states, "No salvageable utility within structure, composition unknown, removal authorized." In Bukhara, another note reads, "Interior design unsuited to known functions, decorative at best." The language betrays the thinking of the time. If a building did not fit into the narrow categories of temple, house, or fortress, it was deemed irrelevant. If it didn't serve a human-centric industrial function, it was noise. Yet the people who lived near these towers knew otherwise. They felt the loss in their bodies. In a testimonial recorded in 1968, a woman from Bukhara remembered how the air became heavier after the tower fell. "Dust used to move on," she said. "Now it lingers." In Ka, a man who grew up beside a tower recalled sleeping near it during summer heat. The air was softer, not wind, something else. After they removed the tower, we couldn't sleep. My father sold the house. These aren't metaphors. They're environmental observations, recorded by ordinary people who didn't know the words convection, resonance, or low-pressure zone, but who could feel the difference the towers made. Engineers noticed too. British surveyor William Thornton, writing in 1866, documented a tower in Central Asia that emitted cool air, even on the sun-facing side. Using a mercury thermometer, he recorded a 4-degree drop in ambient temperature within 3 meters of the base. His report was submitted to the Royal Geographical Society. The response? Interesting curiosity, not relevant to primary survey objectives. His findings were shelved, never followed up, never expanded. Over and over again, the pattern repeats. Observations are made, measurements are taken, notes are filed, and then they disappear into institutional silence, not through conspiracy, but through neglect, through apathy, through the assumption that if something is not understood, it is not important. And then came the final blow. As cities expanded and industrialization accelerated, any remaining towers were either gutted and repurposed or abandoned and left to decay. By the 1950s, fewer than 50 intact towers remained across the entire former network. Most had been turned into water tanks, storage rooms, or communication relays. Their interiors altered, their spiral grooves chipped away, their acoustic properties destroyed. They were no longer towers. They were husks. The official narrative had solidified. These were decorative relics from a feudal past. At best, charming ruins. At worst, wastes of space. Their original purpose, if ever acknowledged, was rebranded as myth. And so, the last echoes of the towers faded, not in fire, not in conquest, but in blueprints never drawn, in reports never written, in knowledge dismissed as irrelevant. And yet, the loss was not total. The structures vanished, but something of their geometry remained. Some stones were reused, some foundations kept, some shapes, like seeds, rooted in the subconscious of architects who never knew what had once stood there. And in that quiet persistence, in the unremembered proportions of a university dome or a courthouse stairwell, the towers began to whisper again. Though the towers themselves were dismantled, forgotten, or ground into the facades of modernity, something survived, a shape, a ratio, an instinct. It did not survive in memory, it survived in design, in cities across Central Asia, the Balkans, and beyond. Modern architects began constructing buildings that unknowingly echoed the geometry of the very towers their predecessors had destroyed. The forms returned, not as intentional revivals, but as subconscious inheritances, proportions etched into blueprints by engineers who never studied ancient resonance, who never spoke the word Tartaria, who never knew they were replicating something lost. Consider the main railway terminal in Tashkent. Completed in 1913, its central hall rises to 42 meters, the exact height recorded in historical tower measurements from the same region. Vertical ventilation shafts pierce the structure at regular intervals, each spaced precisely 7 meters apart, the same internal spacing discovered by structural engineers using laser scans on surviving Tartarian towers. The station was designed for practical airflow, to handle smoke and steam from early locomotives. But passengers began to notice something else. When a train arrived, the station hummed, not loudly, but softly, as if the building itself exhaled in response to the sound. Many described the hum as soothing, calming. No one asked why. It just felt right. Kazan's city courthouse, finished in 1936, stands atop the exact foundation where a demolished tower once stood. According to surviving municipal notes, the architect reused the original foundation stones, citing cost efficiency and structural stability. But when builders replicated the base dimensions, they inadvertently replicated the old tower's proportions. The result? A spiral-shaped stairwell that experiences rotating air currents during windy days, a miniature echo of the airflow dynamics that once governed the entire tower. Workers have described the stairwell as strangely comfortable, temperate, always slightly cooler than expected. A few even call it the breathing corner. In Samarkand, a university auditorium constructed in 1954 occupies the same location where 3 ancient towers once formed an equilateral triangle. The space is widely praised for its acoustic properties. Speakers rarely use microphones. Every word carries. Every tone resonates. In 1968, a Soviet acoustician studied the building and concluded, "The resonance behaves strangely. It responds to voice almost as if the structure remembers something." His report was never published, filed under the innocuous category of architectural curiosities. These are not isolated incidents. In 2022, architectural historian Irina Petrov compiled floor plans from 67 public buildings constructed between 1900 and 1960 across former Tartarian regions. Her intention was to track the evolution of civic space. What she discovered was far more profound. Each building, courthouses, train stations, lecture halls, shared key geometric ratios with the demolished towers. In most cases, the measurements matched within 5% accuracy. Petrov was stunned. The architects had no known access to Tartarian plans. Few had even heard of the towers, and yet they rebuilt them, not literally, but geometrically, functionally. The towers had encoded their logic into stone, and that logic, divorced from historical memory, remained practical, efficient, useful. Engineers chasing airflow stumbled upon the same spiral groove angles. Acoustic designers rediscovered the resonance benefits of tall, vertical shafts. Architects seeking thermal balance returned to the hollow, cylindrical forms once used for passive cooling. We didn't remember the towers, but we remembered what worked. And in that act of practical imitation, the towers were resurrected, not as stone columns piercing the skyline, but as echo chambers inside our civic centers, as breathing walls within our public infrastructure. Why does this matter? Because it proves the towers were not symbolic. They were functional. And that function, even without full understanding, remains so compelling that it reemerges wherever designers seek harmony with air, sound, and human comfort. It's as if the proportions themselves carried wisdom, not through myth or metaphor, but through physical utility. Yet this legacy is incomplete. In the places where nothing was rebuilt, where the towers were destroyed and their foundations uprooted, the effects were different. Elderly residents interviewed in the late 20th century recall districts that became suddenly more uncomfortable after the towers fell. Areas once described as breezy, soft, or easy to breathe in grew hotter, dustier, and more stifling. In places where no unconscious inheritance occurred, where no building replaced the tower, the land changed, the air changed, and with it, so did the people's lives. This contrast between places that forgot and decayed, and places that unknowingly remembered and thrived, tells a deeper story. A story not just of ruins and resonance, but of design that aligns with nature. The towers worked because they were shaped not by style, but by environment. Their geometry wasn't about aesthetics. It was about physics, about biology, about the intersection between form and life. And now, those same principles appear where they are needed most. In hospitals that echo ancient proportions, in metro stations whose arching ceilings amplify calm rather than noise, in libraries whose vertical shafts regulate air without a single fan. In all these places, the logic of the towers lives on, not as myth, but as function, a gentle echo, resonating not through memory, but through purpose. The towers are gone, but something remains, not their stone or shape, not their blueprints or their names, but the absence they left behind, a silence that once held a song. It's not visible in maps. It doesn't appear in statistics at first glance. But if you listen, really listen, to the people who lived in the shadows of those towers, who breathed beside them, who slept in their shade, the story becomes impossible to ignore. It begins not with data, but with memory. In Bukhara, a 73-year-old woman was interviewed in 1968. She remembered dust storms from her childhood, the kind that turned the air to haze. But near the old columns, she said, you could still breathe. The wind was softer there. My grandmother always said the towers cleaned the air. I didn't understand what she meant, not until they tore them down. Afterward, she recalled the dust settling heavier in her lungs, children coughing more, the sweetness of the wind disappearing. In Ka, a man interviewed in 1976 recalled sleeping outside as a boy. Summer nights were unbearable, hot, still, choking, except near the tower. There, the air moved, not like a breeze, something deeper. You could rest. After the tower was demolished, his family abandoned the house. It became unlivable, he said. Even the animals hated it. These stories, scattered across decades and languages, repeat the same pattern. In city after city, the removal of a tower marked a change, not just architectural, but biological. People didn't speak of nostalgia. They spoke of breath, of temperature, of discomfort. A retired municipal worker from Tbilisi, interviewed in 1982, recalled participating in a demolition. We took the stones from the tower to build a new school. 5 years later, people began complaining. Summers too hot, winters too cold, wind too sharp. They didn't blame the tower, of course, but they left the district one by one. He lowered his voice. Before, everyone said it was the most comfortable place in the city. After, not anymore. These aren't metaphors. They're climate observations, microclimatic shifts, documented not by meteorologists but by grandmothers, builders, school teachers, and these memories were not confined to any single region. In surveys conducted from the 1960s to the early 2000s, researchers gathering oral folklore began to notice an unexpected trend. People spoke of the towers as if they were living things, structures that responded to wind, to heat, to sickness. In 2011, environmental researcher Aziz Karimov combed through municipal records across Central Asia. He wasn't looking for towers. He was looking for environmental complaints. He discovered something startling. In districts where towers had been removed between 1880 and 1940, reports of heat stress, respiratory illness, and wind damage increased sharply in the decades that followed. Neighboring districts, those where towers had not been demolished, showed no comparable rise. His conclusion was careful, conservative. Tower removal correlates with measurable decline in localized environmental comfort. Potential contributing factors include loss of thermal mass, disruption of airflow patterns, and removal of passive ventilation structures. Further study required. No further study was ever conducted. But the testimonies kept coming. A Kazakh elder, recorded in 1997, said, "When the towers stood, old people walked more. The air felt lighter. Now even young men complain during wind season. The towers held something back. We lost that protection." An Uzbek woman, interviewed in 2005, recalled her mother's words. When fever came, families gathered near the columns, not to pray, but to breathe. After they destroyed them, fever season became worse. Children died. No one blamed the towers, but my mother always did. These weren't isolated cases. Dozens of interviews across former Tartarian regions echoed the same observations. Not all used the word tower. Some said column, others old stone, or gathering place. But the description was always the same: a structure that changed the air, that calmed it, that made it safer. In a British military medical report from 1891, Surgeon Edmund Clark documented an outbreak of seasonal respiratory illness. Stationed in Central Asia, he noticed a curious behavior. Families brought their children to a nearby ancient column during episodes of severe coughing or breathlessness. Clark observed 42 cases over 3 days. 31 showed measurable improvement within 24 hours of tower proximity. No medical intervention, he wrote, no change in diet or hydration. Improvement correlated with location, mechanism unknown. Elsewhere, other witnesses recorded similar anomalies. In 1847, French merchant Jean-Baptiste Roussel wrote of arriving in Bukhara during a dust storm. Visibility was near zero, yet the tower remained visible, not taller than surrounding buildings, not brighter, but somehow clearer. The dust avoided it. We sheltered at its base. The air began to clear within the hour. The storm continued beyond, but around us, a strange calm. In 1836, Swedish explorer Lars Anderson, traveling through the Caucasus, noted that animals gathered beneath such towers during storms. Birds circled them at dawn. Deer stood still beneath them, even while lightning cracked nearby. Locals call them gathering stones, he wrote. I don't understand it, but the animals do. German geologist Dr. Heinrich Strauss, in 1853, recorded another strange effect. Snow melted faster around the base of certain towers. Not from sun exposure, all sides show equal shade. Yet, snow disappears within 20 meters of the structure. No temperature increase detected, but the effect is consistent. Again, no follow-up. Again. The notes disappeared into an archive. What emerges is not fantasy. It is not even speculation. It is a constellation of fragments, testimonies, journal entries, forgotten observations that all point in the same direction. The towers shaped their environment, not symbolically, physically. They moderated heat, diffused wind, improved airflow, and when they were destroyed, cities lost something fundamental: the ability to breathe. Even more compelling is that the effect was local, not across entire cities, but within circles, zones stretching 200 to 300 meters from each tower's location. Within these circles, air moved differently, felt differently, and when those circles collapsed, so did the comfort they once brought. The people remembered. The institutions didn't. This is the quiet tragedy of erasure, not the loss of history, but the loss of experience, of breath, of comfort we forgot how to name. By now, the pieces no longer resemble myth. They resemble a blueprint, not for a civilization in the fantastical sense, but for one that understood the intimate relationship between structure and survival. The towers that once rose from the steppes of Tartaria, the valleys of the Caucasus, the deserts of Persia, and the riverbanks of the Balkans were not ornamental. They were not superstitious. They were not built in ignorance. They were machines, passive, elegant, enduring machines designed to regulate the very air that gave life to the cities around them. Consider what they did. First, airflow. The vertical hollow shafts, carved with spiral grooves, created a natural convection system. Warm air from the ground entered the base, rotated upward through the spiraling pattern, and exited through the top aperture. The design prevented stagnation. It drew fresh air into dense city centers. It worked with wind when available, and with heat differentials when not. It was simple physics, applied with astonishing precision. Second, sound. The recessed chambers placed at regular intervals created harmonic nodes, resonance points that shaped acoustic energy. When wind or voice entered the shaft, the sound didn't bounce, it transformed. A spoken word became a hum. A gust of wind became a sustained tone. Modern science now knows that this tone, the 7.83 Hz Schumann frequency, has a measurable effect on human physiology. It calms the nervous system, reduces stress, regulates breath. The towers, whether by observation or by calculation, produced it naturally. Third, pressure regulation. The continuous vertical movement of air created localized low-pressure zones at the top of each tower. This subtle pressure gradient induced gentle, persistent air movement at the street level. The effect? Circulation without fans, relief without noise, and, most of all, consistency. In climates marked by heat waves, dust storms, or freezing inversions, this steady airflow mattered. It eased breath, reduced illness, kept life possible. Fourth, temperature control. Stone towers with hollow cores do not hold heat the same way solid buildings do. During hot days, the towers absorbed and redistributed heat. During cool nights, they released it slowly. But more than that, the airflow within the shaft allowed warm air to be vented away while cooler air was pulled in. These were thermal chimneys, constructed without mechanical components, powered only by the sun and the wind. Fifth, humidity modulation. As air spiraled up the tower, moisture condensed along cooler surfaces. In arid seasons, this increased local humidity. In damp conditions, it extracted excess moisture. The result was balance, comfort. A passive atmospheric filter built into the city itself. Sixth, navigation. The tower's consistent spacing, often exactly 144 kilometers apart, created a vast continental network of visual and environmental markers. For travelers on foot, horseback, or caravan, these towers served as waypoints, beacons, landmarks of orientation. Some aligned with trade routes, others stood alone, marking safe zones of breathable air, rest, or shelter. But most critically, these functions were not separate. They were simultaneous. The towers didn't specialize. They harmonized. One structure provided airflow, temperature regulation, humidity balance, acoustic resonance, and navigational utility. All without fuel, without electricity, without supervision. This is not decoration. This is infrastructure. And it is far more advanced than we've been taught to expect from a pre-industrial world. How do we know it worked? Because we've built modern equivalents. Our HVAC systems circulate air. Our hospital architecture uses acoustic dampening. Our smart buildings regulate humidity and temperature. Our GPS satellites provide directional guidance. But our systems require constant input, energy, maintenance, digital control. The towers required none of these. Once built, they simply functioned for decades, for centuries, until we demolished them. And why were they built? Because the people who constructed them faced the same conditions we now try to fix with modern machines. Summer temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, dry air that scorched lungs, dense populations that spread respiratory illness, trade routes stretching across deserts with no markers for orientation. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were survival-level threats. The towers were the solution. They made cities livable. And more than that, they made them healthier. Municipal records from the 19th century show that districts near tower sites consistently reported fewer respiratory illnesses, lower child mortality rates, and more successful caravan arrivals compared to districts without them. Even if the correlation is not absolute, the pattern is there, the evidence remains, filed in forgotten folders, buried in reports, scribbled in travel diaries, piece by piece. It builds a portrait of a knowledge system that used proportion as its language and air as its material. These towers were not magical. They were not sacred. They were not mysterious in the sense of being unknowable. They were practical. That's what makes their loss so profound. They represent a kind of intelligence we are only now beginning to rediscover. an intelligence rooted not in complexity, but in understanding, the kind that builds machines from geometry, that engineers stability from form alone. So, why were they demolished? Because we forgot what they were for. Because their effects were subtle, not spectacular. Because when new ideologies arrived, whether industrialist, imperialist, or revolutionary, they saw only dead stone, not living systems. The towers did not speak loudly. They did not shout their function. They just worked, quietly, constantly, until silence was mistaken for uselessness. And so they fell, crushed by modernization campaigns, erased by progress reports, labeled as decorative, religious, irrelevant. The knowledge they embodied, how to cool a city without electricity, how to ease breath without medicine, how to guide movement without maps, was not destroyed. It was ignored. And yet, even in their absence, the towers leave traces, in the proportion of a railway hall, in the acoustic calm of a public courtroom, in the breath of wind curling through a repurposed stairwell. The geometry persists because it works, because it always worked. What we lost wasn't just function. We lost a philosophy of design, one that saw cities as ecosystems, one that understood human bodies not as separate from the environment, but as part of it, one that built in harmony, not dominance. And it's that philosophy, not the stone itself, that we must recover. We cannot rebuild the exact towers. The cities have changed. The materials are gone. But we can learn, we can study their ratios, recreate their airflow models, test their resonance profiles, and perhaps we can ask a more honest question. How many other things have we demolished without understanding? The towers were not myths, they were machines, and their silence now is not proof of failure, but of our forgetting.